They say every wedding carries a moment you never forget, but I expected mine to be my son's smile, not the stranger standing alone by the field's edge. He watched the ceremony with the stillness of a stone, as if he'd been waiting years for this exact day. When he finally approached me, his voice carried a truth I didn't know was buried beneath our soil. For 40 years, I've lived on this quiet stretch of land just beyond the ridge, a place where winters sink deep into the earth and secrets settle even deeper. My son, Daniel, grew up here among the fields, the barn, and the soft ache of a life built from routine. Our family has always kept its history pressed between silence and hard work, rarely revisiting the past. On the day of his wedding, surrounded by laughter, music, and the pale glow of late autumn light, I thought the past had finally loosened its grip on us. But when the quiet stranger stepped forward, I realized the past had simply been waiting. The music hadn't started yet, but the field was already holding its breath. Autumn light slipped between the rows of white chairs, catching on ribbons, on the lace of my daughter-in-law's veil, on the dust rising from the ground. It should have been a perfect morning, crisp, golden, full of beginnings. But my eyes kept drifting past the last row of chairs, to the man standing alone where the grass grew tall and unbothered. He wasn't part of our celebration, yet he stood there like he'd been waiting for it. I told myself to look away, to focus on Daniel, my son, my boy, straightening his jacket for the 10th time as he stood beneath the willow tree. His smile trembled with nerves, and I felt that soft ache only a mother knows, the kind that swells when you see your child step into a new life. Guests murmured around me, folding programs, smoothing dresses, brushing dust off their shoes. The wood of the chapel benches we borrowed from town creaked as people shifted their weight. Everything felt ordinary, warm, familiar. Except for him, the man beyond the chairs. He stood with his hands loosely at his sides, thumbs hooked in his pockets like he had nowhere else to be. His shirt was plain, not white, not quite gray, and it caught the light in a way that made him seem carved from the morning itself. He wasn't dressed for a wedding, not unless he'd walked here from another time. His boots were scuffed. His hair needed cutting. And yet he watched Daniel the way family sometimes does, the quiet, attentive kind of watching that doesn't draw attention but holds meaning. A few guests turned curious, but he never acknowledged them. He didn't shift, didn't squint against the sun, didn't even brush away the tall grass brushing his legs. Just stood there, steady and still. Something old tugged at me, not memory, but the hint of one. A feeling like recognizing a song you've only heard once as a child. I tried to shake it off. People wander onto farmland all the time. Neighbors get lost. Travelers stop. Birds land where they please. But he wasn't wandering. He wasn't lost. He wasn't waiting for a place to sit. He was bearing witness. The ceremony began with the soft scrape of the guitarist's pick, a gentle, trembling sound that shivered through the morning air. The guests turned. Daniel straightened. His bride stepped from behind the barn, her dress catching bits of sunlight like dew. Everyone watched her. Of course they did. Everyone except one man. The stranger's eyes stayed fixed on my son. Not unkindly. Not overly intent. Just with a familiarity I couldn't reconcile. I watched his jaw tighten once, as if some thought passed through him. He didn't smile. Didn't frown. Simply breathed in, breathed out. When the couple clasped hands, I saw the stranger's fingers curl slightly, a reflex he quickly stilled. Almost as if he felt something on their behalf. Almost as if he remembered something he shouldn't. A younger cousin leaned toward me. "You know him," she whispered. I shook my head. But the truth was softer, heavier. I felt like I should. The vows were being spoken now. Those trembling promises people make when they're still warm with hope. I heard Daniel's voice crack on the words, "my partner in all seasons," and a few tears slipped down my cheek. When I looked back to the stranger, his eyes were lowered. Not in sadness. More like reverence. As if he knew these vows too well. A gust of wind ran across the field then, bending the tall grass around him. His shirt pressed against him, letting me see the rise and fall of his ribs. Steady, controlled, practiced. He'd been here before. Not at this wedding. Not on this exact day. But something about this land, this moment, belonged to him too. And that thought unsettled me more than his presence. When the officiant lifted the couple's hands, "I now pronounce you," a brief hush fell over the guests. That sacred kind of silence just before joy spills out. The stranger chose that moment to step back. Just one step. Small. Measured. But it changed everything. The grass behind him parted. The sunlight caught the edge of his profile. And for a split second, I saw something sharp flicker across his face. Recognition, maybe. Pain, maybe. Relief, even. It wasn't that he wanted to leave. More like he was bracing himself. Preparing for whatever came next. My heartbeat stumbled. He wasn't here out of curiosity. He wasn't passing through. He wasn't admiring the wedding of strangers. He was here with purpose. And the way he stepped back, like a man making room for a truth long overdue, sent a cold thread through the warm morning. He lifted his gaze then, meeting mine across the field. A brief moment. A still one. I expected him to look away. People usually do when caught. He didn't. His eyes held mine with a quiet, steady weight. Not threatening. Not pleading. Just known. Like he'd been waiting for me to notice him. The vows ended. Applause rose. Guests stood. Music swelled. But all I could hear was that step he took. The sound of grass shifting beneath someone who'd been standing still for far too long. And all I could feel was the faint pull of memory that wasn't quite a memory at all. The reception lights flickered on just as the sun slipped behind the barn roof, turning everything gold for a moment. The tables, the mason jars, the dust drifting in the air. People were laughing, lifting glasses, gathering plates of food that smelled like home. But all I could see, just beyond the edge of the celebration, was the shape of a man leaning against the old fence. Hands in his pockets. Eyes not on us, but on the fields as if they were speaking to him. And I felt that same quiet unease settle deeper, like a pebble sinking through water. I tried to shake it off. This was Daniel's day, after all, my son, glowing with the kind of joy I hadn't seen since he was small enough to chase chickens around the yard, stumbling on his own shoelaces. He stood near the buffet table now, laughing with his new in-laws, his arm wrapped around the woman he'd chosen. I watched him the way mothers do. You think you'll get used to seeing your child grown, but it always hits in waves. The pride, the disbelief, the fear that time slipped too quickly. People moved around me, brushing by with plates and stories and familiar voices. My sister tapped my elbow, telling me the cake had arrived early. Someone else joked about the photographer being late again. The music drifted between upbeat and slow, each song carrying its own kind of nostalgia. It should have been enough to anchor me, but my attention kept drifting back to him. The stranger hadn't moved far since the ceremony ended. The fence he leaned on was older than Daniel, weathered, splintered, softened by years of rain. The boards sagged in the middle, held up only by habit and rusted nails. It wasn't a place people normally chose to stand, but he stood there like it was familiar ground. Like the shape of that fence meant something to him. Every few minutes, his gaze swept across the fields, slowly, deliberately, pausing at patches of earth only someone with history here would know. The dip behind the barn where the soil stays damp. The far corner where the willow casts its longest shadow. The slope near the gravel road where the land begins to forget its own flatness. He wasn't sightseeing. He was remembering. And that was what unsettled me most. I watched two cousins whisper about him by the lemonade table. One of them peeked over her shoulder, trying to be subtle, but subtlety had never been her strength. They shrugged at each other, curiosity passing between them like a small spark, but neither dared approach. Nobody did. Weddings pull strangers together all the time. Friends of friends, extended families, co-workers you nod to without knowing their stories. But there was something different about him. He wasn't mingling or waiting to be invited. He was observing, like he'd come to take in the view, not join the celebration. I carried a plate of food to a table near the edge of the yard, trying to convince myself to stop staring. The wooden chair creaked beneath me, remembering the last time it was used, maybe. These chairs always remembered. I took a slow sip of punch. Sweet, watery, familiar. But my eyes drifted back anyway. He hadn't changed position. His hands were still in his pockets, fingers tapping against the denim in a quiet, rhythmic way, like someone thinking through something carefully. His shoulders were relaxed, too relaxed for someone out of place. And his expression, soft, still, unreadable, gave nothing away. I pressed my palms together, feeling the warmth of the day settling into my skin. I should have walked over. Introduced myself. At least asked if he needed anything. That's what my mother would have done. But the thought of approaching him made something tighten in my chest. Because deep down I wasn't sure I wanted an answer to who he was. Or why he looked at my home like he'd once belonged to it. I glanced back at Daniel, who was lifting his wife off the ground playfully, both of them laughing so hard their eyes shined. For a moment, that warmth settled over me again. His happiness was enough to drown out the unease. Almost, but not quite. I don't know what made me look up when I did. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was that small internal nudge, the one that sometimes arrives before thought fully forms. Whatever it was, I lifted my eyes and met his. For a single heartbeat, everything around me blurred. The noise faded. The music softened. Even Daniel's laughter became distant. The stranger's gaze held mine quietly, calmly. Like he'd been waiting for me to look. Like he'd known I would eventually. His eyes weren't cold. Weren't warm either. They were something in between, something contemplative, softened by familiarity he didn't explain. I inhaled slowly, unsure what expression was slipping onto my own face. Then he did something small, so small I almost missed it. His lips lifted in a faint smile. But it wasn't a joyful smile. Or a polite one. Or even a curious one. It was a knowing smile. A quiet acknowledgement. A smile with weight behind it, something practiced, perhaps, or once familiar. And it didn't reach his eyes. I felt a ripple of recognition, not in my mind, but somewhere lower, like my bones knew him before my memory did. He held the smile just a moment longer, then let it fade. Not abruptly. Not shyly. Just gently, as if releasing a truth he wasn't ready to say out loud. I swallowed hard. No wedding guest, no stranger, should look at me like that. Not unless they knew something about me. Or about this place. Or about the past we buried under years and tall grass. For the first time all evening, I felt cold. I rose from my chair slowly, smoothing my dress with hands that suddenly felt too warm. Daniel and his bride began their first dance, the soft lights catching on their joined hands, their quiet, radiant smiles. Everyone turned toward them. Everyone except him. The stranger's gaze was still on me. Steady, calm, patient. As if he wasn't waiting for the groom at all. As if his purpose here had nothing to do with vows or celebration. As if he'd come for me. He looked away then, just briefly, toward the far end of the field. Then back again. And in that small exchange, I understood one thing with a clarity that chilled my spine. Whatever tied him to this land, whatever brought him to my son's wedding, whatever truth he carried, it hadn't even begun to surface yet. And he wasn't leaving until it did. The lanterns were just beginning to glow when I first noticed him again, standing alone near the last row of chairs. The sunset caught the dust in the air behind him, turning the whole yard into a slow-moving haze of gold and rust. Everyone else was drifting toward the tables, laughing, clinking glasses. But he stayed still, watching the field like it was calling his name. And somehow, I knew he was waiting for me. Weddings have a way of pulling noise out of quiet places. Our farm had never sounded so alive, strings humming, glasses chiming, footsteps brushing over fresh-cut grass. Even the old barn seemed to stand a little straighter, as if proud to be dressed up in white ribbon and eucalyptus leaves. Daniel had been smiling all day, the kind of smile that starts in the eyes first. Seeing him with his wife, the way she tucked her arm around his, the way he whispered something that made her laugh. It made the years feel softer, almost gentle. But even gentle days have edges. And I felt one of them the moment I saw that stranger by the chairs. He didn't blend in, not the way the others did. Something about his posture, hands folded in front of him, head tilted slightly as if listening to something no one else could hear, pulled at me. Like a thread I wasn't ready to tug on. Still, he didn't move. For almost an hour, he stayed there, standing in that fading light, watching the field beyond the barn. I tried to ignore him. Told myself he was just someone from her side of the family, maybe an old teacher or a distant cousin. But every time I glanced over, he was still there. Quiet. Still. Waiting. And the sun kept falling lower, stretching the shadows across the field like long, reaching fingers. By the time the music shifted to the slow songs and the younger guests began drifting toward the dance floor, I felt the tension settle in my chest. As if something long buried had stirred just an inch beneath the soil. I didn't want anything ruining this day. Not after everything Daniel had fought through to get here. Not after all the storms we'd survived, spoken and unspoken. But when I finally turned back toward the stranger, he wasn't standing by the chairs anymore. He was walking toward me. He moved like someone carrying a memory too heavy to rush. There was nothing threatening in his steps, nothing sharp. Just a slow, steady approach, the way a man walks when he's certain of what he came for. I stood near the old maple tree, pretending to adjust the lantern hung from one of the branches. Anything to look busy. Anything to make this moment feel less direct than it was. He stopped a few feet away, close enough for me to notice the dust on his shoes, the faint tremble in his fingers. The light hit his face in soft angles, worn, tired, but not unkind. He spoke first. Evening. His voice was gentle, but it carried something bruised underneath, like a bruise that hadn't finished forming. Evening, I managed. You with the bride's side? Or the groom's? He hesitated. Neither, actually. There was no smile. No apology for the interruption. Just a quiet truth, placed between us like a stone. I'm Elias, he said. Only that. No last name. Just Elias. Spoken like it was all the introduction he could offer, or all he was willing to give. My fingers tightened slightly around the lantern hook. Well, it's a private event, I said. If you're lost. I'm not lost. His voice didn't rise, but something in it pressed lightly against me, insisting he be heard. I didn't come for the wedding. He let the words sink in. I felt the evening cool shift along my arms, raising small, uneasy prickles. I came, he continued softly, for closure. Closure. A word that rarely means anything good. My eyes flicked instinctively toward Daniel. He was laughing with two of his old school friends near the drink table, unaware of the man standing in front of me, unaware of the word hanging heavy in the air. I forced my voice to stay calm. This is my son's day. If you have business, it can wait. But Elias didn't argue. He simply turned his head, slowly, almost reverently, toward the field behind the barn. And he stared at it like someone recognizing an old grave. The field looked ordinary enough from where we stood. Rows of grass, soft and uneven from the last rain, dipping slightly into the hollow where the soil had always held more water than it should. Nothing about it seemed remarkable. Nothing that anyone else would look twice at. But Elias's eyes stayed on it with a focus that chilled something inside me. A quiet certainty, like he had been standing in that field long before this day, long before these decorations and music and lights. He spoke without looking at me. There's something out there, he murmured. Something I need to see. My stomach tightened, the way it does when a memory brushes the wrong corner of your mind. You need to leave, I said quietly. Now. Still he didn't move. He only lowered his gaze toward the earth beneath his feet, then back to the field, as though tracing a line between past and present. It's been a long time, he whispered. Too long. The way he said it made the air feel colder, made the distance between us and the barn seem suddenly vast. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. Whatever you think you know, whatever you came for, this isn't the time. Finally, he looked at me, and for the first time since he approached, I saw the sorrow in his eyes, not theatrical, not dramatic, just deep. Deep enough to make me swallow. I'm not here to ruin anything, he said. I promise you that. His gaze drifted once more toward the field. But I can't leave without facing what's out there. The lantern above us flickered, just once, as the breeze pushed against it. The shadows shifted across his face like passing clouds. I felt something shift inside me too. A reminder of the day we first bought this land, of the part of the field we had never tilled, of the story I told Daniel when he was small about why that one patch stayed untouched. A story with missing pieces. A story he never questioned. A story I wasn't sure was entirely mine to tell. Elias took one slow breath. Please, he said softly. Just a moment of your time. The music had softened behind us. People were drifting toward the fire pit, into that warm half-light where laughter blends with smoke. But I stood there beneath the maple tree, staring at the man who wasn't invited, and at the field he couldn't stop looking at. The sun was almost gone now, leaving the sky scraped with the last streaks of orange. Elias stepped back, giving me space, waiting for my choice. I should have walked away. Should have let the day stay bright and untouched. But something in his expression, that quiet ache, that patience, held me still. And for the first time, I felt a small, trembling question rise inside me. The music had softened into something almost fragile when Elias began to speak. The lanterns hanging from the trees flickered in the breeze, their light trembling across his face like they weren't sure they should be shining on him. Guests drifted behind us in slow, blurry movements, laughter rising and falling like distant waves, but his words cut through it all, low and steady. I remember the way his gaze stayed on the field behind the barn, as if the soil itself was listening. And before he even finished the first sentence, I knew his story wasn't just his. Weddings are supposed to feel like beginnings. Light, warm, untangled. But as Elias's voice settled into the quiet between us, something old and heavy stirred just beneath my ribs. We stood a little apart from the celebration, close enough to hear the clinking of glasses, far enough that no one noticed the stillness forming around us. The sky was turning the slow blue of evening, the kind that makes edges softer, memories closer. He didn't look at me as he started. His eyes stayed fixed on the far field, on that patch of grass that held more shadows than sun at this hour. The shape of his posture made me think of someone bracing themselves. People brushed past us on their way to the buffet table, holding small plates and soft smiles. They had no idea that the air between Elias and me had shifted, become quieter, denser, waiting. And maybe that's why I didn't stop him. Maybe I couldn't. Because something about the weight in his voice, the careful way he shaped each word, it reached into a part of me I hadn't touched in years. A place filled with half-memories, softened by time but never fully forgotten. I felt the cold before I understood it. The kind that comes not from the air, but from recognition. There was a family, Elias said softly, almost as if he feared the trees might overhear. Not far from here. Lived on the edge of the ridge. He didn't offer a name. Not for the place. Not for the people. Just a family. But it was enough to make my breath slow. A father, he continued, the quiet sort. Spent most evenings out in the fields, working until the light was gone. He paused, and I swear I could feel the weight of that father's silhouette settling across the land behind us. A brother too. Younger but bigger in spirit. Loyal to a fault. His voice grew thinner around the edges, stretched by something like memory. A night came, Elias murmured, when things shifted. There was drinking. A misunderstanding. A mistake. A mistake. The word fell like a stone dropped into water. Quiet, but with ripples I could feel under my skin. I swallowed, staring past him at the field that always looked so harmless in the daylight. He still hadn't looked at me. It was like he was reliving something instead of telling it. People moved around us in soft circles, a bridesmaid adjusting her shawl, an uncle refilling his drink, but none of them carried the heaviness Elias did. And as he spoke, something inside me tightened. Not because the story was tragic, but because it was familiar. Too familiar. Elias shifted his hands, rubbing his thumb over the edge of his palm like he was trying to smooth out something that couldn't be smoothed. The younger one, he said quietly. He tried to step in. Tried to keep things from going too far. The lantern above us flickered, and I felt the cold in my chest deepen. And the father, he didn't mean to. My breath caught. That phrase, he didn't mean to, was the exact one I remembered hearing through a cracked doorway as a child. Spoken by men whose voices I tried to forget. Elias drew in a slow breath. The night ended quiet. No shouting. No breaking. He paused. Just a heaviness that couldn't be undone. I felt my fingertips go numb. He still hadn't given names. Didn't need to. The shape of his silence filled them in. Behind us, someone called Daniel's name. A bright, joyful sound that didn't match the cold settling between Elias and me. He finally looked at me then. And in his eyes, I didn't see accusation. I saw grief. Long, weathered grief. You understand, he said softly. Not a question. A realization. My throat felt too tight to answer. Because the truth was, I did understand. More than I wanted to. More than I'd ever admitted, even to myself. The story wasn't new to me. I had lived in the shadow of it. But how did this stranger know it so well? Closing scene, 100 to 150 words. A cool breeze drifted across the yard, brushing the grass in a slow ripple. The lantern swayed, throwing shifting patterns of gold and dark across Elias's face. He didn't move toward the field. He didn't need to. The weight of his story was already there, anchored deep in the soil, waiting for the years to catch up with it. Behind us, laughter rose again, warm, bright, untouched. But I couldn't turn toward it. Not yet. Elias stepped back, letting the silence settle between us like dust. There's more you should hear, he said gently. But only if you're ready. I wasn't ready. Not even close. And still, I felt my eyes drifting toward the field, toward the place where memory and truth had begun to blur. The last of the wedding lanterns were still glowing when Elias asked me to walk with him. Their light wavered across the yard like tired fireflies, drifting further and further behind us as we moved toward the far field. The music had quieted into a soft hum, distant enough that it felt like it belonged to someone else's world, not mine. The evening air was thin and cool, slipping through the folds of my jacket. I remember thinking the ground looked different in that light. Exposed somehow. Elias walked ahead of me, shoulders heavy, as if he was following something only he could see. The field had always been there, just beyond the barn, a stretch of land we rarely tended but never fully forgot. It carried the kind of history families don't talk about. Not out of secrecy, but because saying the words out loud might make them too real. As a child, I used to run across it without a second thought, my bare feet brushing through tall grass that seemed to whisper its own stories. But after that one storm, the one that tore branches from trees and left the whole town silent the next morning, my father stopped us from playing back there. "We leave that part of the land alone," he had said. And that was it. No explanation, no argument. Just a quiet boundary drawn in dirt. Now, walking beside Elias, I felt every step echo with something I didn't want to remember. The reception lights dimmed behind us until they were nothing but soft flickers against a rising dusk. Daniel's laughter, warm and steady, faded into the distance. I should have gone back. Should have been inside, celebrating him, staying in that moment of joy I'd waited years to see. But Elias's presence pulled at something deep in my chest. Not urgency. Recognition. As if whatever waited out in the far field had been waiting for me, too. We reached the old fence line, the wood sagging with age and weather, laced with thin strands of rusted wire. Elias stopped there, resting his hand on one of the posts like it was a grave marker. The evening light stretched long shadows across the ground, painting the field in strips of gold and gray. "That storm," he murmured, almost to himself. "It changed this place." I felt my stomach tighten. He shouldn't have known about the storm. Yet his voice carried the certainty of someone who had been here, as if he had felt the same fear that had settled into our walls afterward. He stepped over the fence slowly, carefully, like a man approaching an old wound. I followed, though every part of me felt heavier the closer we got to the center of the field. The ground looked disturbed, not freshly, but in that subtle, uneven way that comes only when time tries to smooth out what people would rather forget. Elias walked with purpose until he reached a spot I hadn't stood near in years. A familiar unease crawled up my spine. "This is it," he whispered. He didn't have to explain what it meant. The stillness of the air said enough. Elias lowered himself to the ground, knees pressing into the earth with a kind of reverence. His fingers hovered above the soil before he finally touched it, tracing the uneven patches like he was reading a faded map. "This ground remembers," he said softly. "Even when people try to forget." I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. The field around us felt too quiet. No wind, no insects, just the faint, far-off sound of music drifting from the reception. He pressed his palm flat against the earth. "Something happened here," he continued, voice trembling. "Something that changed two families forever." A long silence followed. My breath felt trapped in my chest. I could see it, the stormy night, the shouting carried by wind, the way my father had come in at dawn with mud on his boots and a silence that made my mother cry behind closed doors. I had been too young to understand it then, too scared to ask later. "How do you know this place?" I whispered. Elias looked up at me finally, his eyes glassy with held-back memory. "Because," he said, "my brother never came home after that storm." The field seemed to tilt beneath me. Cold rushed through my limbs. And suddenly I knew, without needing the details, what truth had been buried here. What truth my father carried for the rest of his life. The last of the sunlight slipped behind the ridge, leaving the field washed in muted twilight. Elias's hand rested on the earth, as if he were touching someone he'd lost, someone he had been searching for across years and miles. I stood there, unable to speak, unable to look away from the place where past and present pressed against each other like two sides of a thin wall. Far behind us, the wedding lights glimmered, warm, innocent, unaware. But here, the ground felt heavy with old truths. Elias rose slowly, his eyes never leaving the soil. "There's more," he said quietly. "But it's not my story to finish." The breeze stirred at last, cold and thin. And I felt it, the past waking up beneath my feet. The field felt different once the sun had slipped past the ridge, as if the land itself were holding its breath. A faint chill moved through the grass, brushing against my ankles like the memory of a hand. Elias stood a few paces ahead of me, his back to the wedding lights, his silhouette framed by the quiet stretch of earth that seemed to swallow the last traces of daylight. He didn't speak at first. He just looked out across the field with the stillness of someone preparing to open an old wound. And when he finally exhaled, it sounded like he'd been holding that breath for decades. I'd always thought of the far field as a kind of boundary, the place where childhood ended and caution began. Even long after we stopped tending it, the grass kept growing there, tall and unbothered, hiding things the way a blanket hides what's beneath it. My father had never allowed us past the fence after the storm. He didn't shout, he simply said, "We stay clear of that well." in a tone that left no room for questions. The well had collapsed during the storm, or so we were told, but there was something in the way he said it, a tired heaviness that made us obey without knowing why. As a child, I thought the field was cursed. Not in a fairy tale way, more like the land knew something, and I wasn't brave enough to ask. Now, standing beside Elias, the weight of that place pressed against my chest. His presence felt too familiar, too certain. Like he wasn't discovering anything new. He was confirming something he already feared. The wedding music floated faintly across the yard, soft and warm, a cruel contrast to the cold settling over this patch of earth. Elias's shoulders lifted with a slow breath. Then he began to speak. "It was 32 years ago," he said, voice steady but thin. "My brother, Aaron. He went missing the night the storm rolled in." The name hit me harder than I expected. Not because I recognized it, but because he said it the way people say the name of the dead. Careful, almost reverent. "We lived just north of here," he continued, pointing toward the treeline. "Small place. Leaky roof. You could hear the wind before you felt it." I listened, the air around us tightening like a string being drawn. He'd gone out to check on the animals. Said he'd be 15 minutes. When he didn't come back, my father lit the lantern and went after him. Elias's jaw tensed. I followed, his fingers curled unconsciously, as if gripping the handle of that lantern again. We found his footprints first. Scuffled, like he'd been startled or pushed. Then we found the lantern. He paused, eyes fixed on the earth beneath us. The glass was shattered. The metal bent. A faint breeze moved past us. Even the field seemed to shiver. And after that, I asked, though part of me didn't want the answer. Elias looked up, meeting my eyes with something raw. "Nothing," he said. "No trail. No sound. Just silence. The kind of silence that doesn't come from nature, but from fear." My breath caught the moment he said it, that silence. Because I remembered it, too. Not through his story, but through my own memory. The storm had torn through our home that night, rattling the windows like someone pounding to be let in. And in the morning, my father came back from the field with mud on his jeans and a look that hollowed him out for weeks. He never explained what he'd been doing out there. He just told us to stay away, especially from the old well. Elias stepped closer to the edge of the field where the ground sloped gently downward. "We searched for weeks," he said, voice cracking slightly. "Neighbors helped at first. Dogs, volunteers, even the sheriff. But the storm had washed away everything we needed." He knelt again, almost involuntarily, his hand pressing into the soil. "My mother couldn't sleep," he whispered. "She kept the porch light on for years, just in case Aaron found his way home." There was a pause, long, fragile. "And I kept coming back here," he added, "even when everyone told me to stop. I always felt like this land knew something." His eyes traced the uneven patches of earth. "This place holds answers," he said softly. "I'm sure of it." I swallowed hard, feeling the cold settle deeper into my bones. What he didn't know, what I suddenly feared, was that the answers might involve my family, and the well my father never talked about. The sky had faded into a deep blue, the first stars trembling into view. The wedding lights flickered behind us, tiny and distant, like memories I couldn't quite hold on to. Elias stayed kneeling, his hands still on the ground, as if he were waiting for the earth to speak. I watched him silently, my heart pulling against something tight and unseen, an old thread stitched into my childhood, now being tugged loose. I looked toward the far corner of the field, where the old well had once stood before collapsing into itself. The grass there grew different, thicker, darker. A breath I didn't know I was holding slipped out of me. If Elias kept digging into the past, what would he find buried beneath this soil? And more frightening, what would it reveal about my father? The path to the old well felt narrower than I remembered, as if the weeds had conspired to hide it from us. Moonlight slipped between the branches, thin and pale, catching on the rusted nails of the boards that lay across the opening. Elias walked ahead of me, slow, deliberate, his boots pressing softly into the damp soil. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air around the well always seemed a little colder, a little quieter, like the land was guarding a secret it had sworn to keep. When Elias finally stopped, he placed his hand on one of the warped planks. It didn't move, but something in the ground seemed to exhale. I hadn't stood this close to the well since I was a child. Back then, my father's warnings hung heavier than the summer heat. "Don't go near it," he'd said, each word pushed through clenched teeth. It wasn't anger. It was fear, the kind that crawls under the skin and stays there. He sealed the well the next morning after the storm. Didn't wait for help. Didn't speak while he hammered the boards down with quick, desperate blows. I watched from the porch, my small fingers curled around the rail, knowing better than to ask why. Tonight, as Elias circled the well, I felt that same childhood unease stirring inside me. The air carried a faint smell of wet earth and old wood. A cicada buzzed somewhere in the trees, then fell silent, as if sensing something it didn't want to interrupt. I remembered my father's face the night he came home. The mud splattered up to his knees, the way he kept rubbing his hands together like he was trying to scrub off something he couldn't see. Elias stooped slightly, brushing aside the weeds with care, as though each leaf meant something. As though this place wasn't just a memory to him, but a message waiting to be read. A message buried beneath our silence. "What did they tell you about this place?" Elias asked quietly, not looking up. I hesitated. The truth felt fragile. Just that the well collapsed in the storm. That it wasn't safe. He nodded once, but I could tell he didn't believe it. Or maybe he'd never believed it. He walked around the perimeter again, eyes scanning the ground the way someone reads the lines of an old letter. "I came here once," he said. "Years after Aaron disappeared. I didn't get close. Just looked from a distance." The breeze lifted the edge of one board, making it tap softly against another. The sound reminded me of bones knocking together. Elias crouched near the northern side of the well. "There used to be a path here. My father said Aaron sometimes cut through this patch when he was in a hurry." He brushed his thumb across a patch of earth where the weeds didn't grow as thick. "Storm washed it out, I guess." I watched his hands, steady, methodical, searching for something he didn't dare name. Then he spoke again, softer this time. "Someone told me once they heard a shout that night, coming from this direction." My breath stilled. "A shout?" He nodded. "A neighbor. Old man. He told my father in private. It was never shared officially." The cicadas had gone silent completely now. The night held its breath with me. My heart tightened before I could stop it. The memory came back too clearly. My father stepping into the kitchen that night, dripping from the storm, his boots caked in heavy mud. He wouldn't meet our eyes. He just said, "Go to bed," in a voice so low it felt borrowed. Why hadn't he told anyone about the shout? Or the mud? Or the way he'd disappeared into the field before dawn? Elias straightened slowly, dusting his palms against his jeans. "If someone heard a shout," he said, "then Aaron didn't just wander off. Someone must have been with him." He paused. "Or something happened here. At the well." The boards creaked under a shifting breeze, making me flinch even though I knew the sound was harmless. I stepped closer, close enough to see the places where the wood had splintered, not from age but from force. My father had hammered these down quickly, too quickly. Why didn't anyone speak of this sooner? I whispered. Elias turned to me, the moonlight catching the exhaustion around his eyes. "Because grief makes people quiet," he said. "And fear makes them quieter." He didn't accuse. He didn't ask the questions I could feel hanging in the air. But the silence between us deepened, thick and uneasy, as if the well itself was listening. And suddenly, I wasn't sure whether we were uncovering the truth, or waking something that had been waiting. A thin fog began to rise from the ground, settling low over the grass. Elias stepped back from the well, his breath visible in the cold air. I stayed where I was, staring at the boards, noticing how one corner dipped lower than the rest, as if the earth beneath it had shifted. Or caved. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Then another. The fields rarely echoed like that unless something moved across them. Elias whispered, "This place remembers." I didn't answer. My eyes were fixed on the dark space between the boards, the thin crack of nothingness that once swallowed light, and maybe more. And for the first time, I wondered if the well hadn't collapsed on its own, or if my father had sealed it to keep something, or someone, from ever being found. The house felt different when I stepped back inside, like the walls had swallowed our absence and were deciding what to do with it. The evening light slanted through the kitchen window, long and thin, settling across the wooden table where I placed the old box. Dust drifted up in slow spirals, catching the fading gold. Elias waited by the doorway, quiet as ever. His eyes lingered on the box the way people look at gravestones, with a mix of caution and inevitability. I touched the lid with my thumb. The cardboard was soft from age. Somewhere deep inside, a memory stirred. My father's voice. My father's silence. Both waiting to be opened. I hadn't touched my father's belongings since the day we cleared his room. Back then, everything felt too heavy, too sharp. Even the simplest objects carried echoes, his shirt smelling faintly of soap, his boots still holding the imprint of his ankles. We boxed them quietly, promising ourselves we'd sort through them another time. But another time never came. Now the box sat between us like an old wound finally asking to be looked at. Elias pulled out a chair but didn't sit. He stayed standing, a respectful distance away, as though he knew this moment wasn't meant to be rushed. I opened the lid. The first thing I saw was the lantern. Cracked glass. Bent handle. Mud still clinging to the base like dried memories. My breath caught. I remembered my father carrying it on stormy nights, the way the flame flickered across his face, carving shadows that didn't come from the weather. Beneath the lantern were folded papers, maps of the property, some yellowed, some nearly new. My father's handwriting crawled across the pages in tight, careful lines. Symbols. Dates. Circles around certain places. But one area was marked more than the rest. The far field. The well. My fingers trembled before I could stop them. Elias leaned closer, finally taking a seat across from me. The chair creaked softly under him, a familiar sound in the quiet room. He picked up one of the maps with both hands, handling it the way someone holds a delicate memory. Gently, but with purpose. "He mapped all of this?" he murmured. "Every inch," I said. "He walked the property every week after the storm. Sometimes late at night." Elias traced one of the penciled symbols with his thumb. It looked like a small cross inside a circle. Next to it was a date, written twice, the second time darker, almost pressed through the paper. "This is the week Aaron went missing," he said. My chest tightened. He unfolded another sheet, a rough sketch of the well area. Faint lines marked places where the ground dipped. A few notes were scribbled along the edge. Check again. Sink deeper here. Not here, not yet. Elias's jaw clenched, but his voice stayed calm. "Your father came back. Over and over." I swallowed hard. He never told us. The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls leaning in as though they wanted to hear the truth too. The lantern on the table reflected a slice of dying sunlight, scattering it across the paper like fractured stars. What was he looking for? Elias whispered. I didn't know, but part of me feared the answer had been buried with him. Elias sifted through the maps until he found a small notebook tucked at the bottom of the box. Its cover was worn smooth, the edges softened by time and hands that must have lingered over it often. He opened it carefully. Small, cramped handwriting filled the pages, my father's voice trapped in ink. He read a line aloud, barely above a whisper. Ground unsettled again. Rain changes everything. Another page. Heard something at dusk. Must return. He paused at the next one, his breath unsteady. Saw lantern light by the well. Not mine. The silence that followed was heavy, dense enough to feel. I remembered that night. The storm, the shouting wind, the way my father went out with the lantern and didn't return until dawn. He sat at the table afterward, hands shaking, clothes soaked through. My mother asked nothing. He said nothing. Elias looked up at me now, his eyes searching mine with a quiet desperation. He knew something. Maybe not everything, but something. I forced the words out. He tried to fix it, or cover it, or understand it. The notebook trembled slightly in Elias's hands. Why didn't anyone speak of this? Why didn't he? I didn't have an answer. Only a rising ache, old, familiar, pressing against my ribs. My father had returned to the well again and again, long after everyone else had stopped searching, as if the truth still lingered in the soil, or in his conscience. Elias closed the notebook and set it gently on top of the maps. For a moment, neither of us moved. The fading daylight slipped away completely, leaving the room washed in quiet blue shadows. I touched the cracked lantern, running my thumb along the broken glass. It felt colder than I expected. My father carried this the night he came home covered in mud, I said softly. He never used it again. Elias stood, his chair scraping lightly across the floor. The sound felt final somehow. Whatever he found, he murmured, it didn't let him go. I looked back at the box, at the crossed-out dates, the circles around the well, the places where his pencil had dug too deep. And for the first time, I wondered if my father hadn't been searching for the truth, but trying to bury it. The sun was slipping behind the tree line when we stepped back into the field, its last light stretched thin across the grass, like someone had pulled the day taut, and it was ready to snap. The shadows of the old fence posts reached toward us, long and crooked, guiding our steps in a way that felt more like a warning than a welcome. Elias walked just ahead of me, his shoulders hunched, as though the weight of the coming truth was already resting on them. The wind carried the faint smell of damp earth and iron. The kind of smell you don't forget, even if you try. Even if someone tried to help you forget. The boards covering the well hadn't moved in years. Moss clung to their edges, and weeds curled through the cracks like they'd claimed it for themselves. I could almost hear my father's voice in the back of my mind, warning me away the way he used to. Not in anger, but in fear disguised as firmness. Back then I never questioned it. Children rarely question the things their parents fear. Now, standing over the same boards, I felt like I was standing on the fragile roof of a memory I'd never fully understood. My hands hesitated at my sides, palms warm and trembling. Elias knelt first, brushing away dirt with slow, reverent strokes. The way someone touches a gravestone they're not ready to read. "You sure?" he asked quietly, eyes still on the boards. "No," I said. "But we're here." He nodded once, and together we slid our fingers under the edges. The boards groaned when they lifted, a tired sound, like they'd been asked to remember something they'd spent decades trying to forget. Cold air rose from below. Thick, wet, heavy with the scent of old metal and stone. Elias steadied himself on the rim. "This is where the truth begins," he whispered. I wasn't sure if he meant for me to hear it. Elias pulled a small light from his pocket, the kind used by campers, its beam narrow but steady. He clicked it on, and for a moment the glow hovered between us, soft and hesitant, before he lowered it into the darkness. The beam swayed, catching the rough stone walls, the damp moss clinging to them, the slow drip of water making tiny echoes that rose like distant footsteps. Elias leaned farther in, his breath shallow. Then the light touched something. A flash of dull metal. Something torn. Something pale. His hand tightened around the flashlight until his knuckles turned white. "Fabric," he murmured. "Cloth, maybe from a jacket." My stomach nodded. I stepped closer, though every instinct told me to keep distance from whatever the well wanted to show us. Elias angled the light slowly. Its beam settled on a twisted scrap of metal beside the cloth, rusted through but still identifiable. A lantern frame. My breath caught in my throat. My father's lantern had been bent. Broken, but not lost. Elias swallowed. His voice faltered as he said, "There's more." He shifted the beam again, and for one fleeting second, the light glinted off something smooth. Round. Unmistakably human. Just a fragment, but enough to collapse years of silence all at once. I felt the ground tilt beneath me, not in motion, but in memory. Pieces I'd tried to ignore for years rose up around me like dust shaken from an old coat. My father's muddy boots. The trembling in his hands. The way he sealed the well himself, refusing help, refusing questions. Elias inhaled sharply, eyes fixed on the darkness. "He fell," he whispered, his voice frayed. "My brother, he must have fallen in." He closed his eyes, not fighting the tremor that passed through him. All those nights we searched, all the places we looked. I stared at the broken lantern frame, at the scraps of cloth barely holding themselves together after decades underground. "My father found him," I said, though the words barely formed. "Or found enough to know." Elias opened his eyes. They glistened, but he didn't let the tears fall. He shook his head slowly, not in denial, but in the kind of acceptance that cuts more deeply than grief. "He didn't want us to live with that," he murmured. "He wanted to spare us the image. The truth." The weight of my father's choices settled across my shoulders. Heavy, but no longer sharp. He hadn't hidden a crime. He'd carried a burden. One meant to shield a grieving family already shattered by loss. Elias exhaled a long, uneven breath, the kind that lets something go even if you're not ready. His face softened. Heartbreak and relief layered so tightly together it was impossible to see where one ended and the other began. We left the well open a moment longer, letting the light from Elias's lantern rest on what lay below. Not to expose it fully, just enough to acknowledge it. To let the earth know we weren't afraid of its truth anymore. When Elias finally turned off the light, the darkness rose gently to take its place, as though it had been waiting for the chance. He stepped back, shoulders sinking with exhaustion and release. "Thank you," he said quietly. "It wasn't meant for me alone." I looked at the rim of the well, at the boards we'd lifted, at the field that had held its silence all these years. "What comes next?" I asked softly. Elias looked toward the house, toward the horizon, toward everything still waiting to unfold. "We tell the truth," he said, "even if it's late." And the field, for the first time in decades, felt lighter. The wind reached the well before we did. It moved across the stones in a slow circle, as if it had been waiting all along, practicing the shape of our grief. Elias sat first. He lowered himself with the carefulness of someone stepping into a memory, not a place. I followed, my knees brushing the old dust that clung to the rim. The field around us stretched out in quiet strips of gold and gray. The sun was almost gone, but its last light lay across Elias's shoulders, soft and forgiving. He didn't speak yet. Neither did I. The well did enough talking for all of us. We sat there until the sky lost its color completely. Only then did Elias draw a breath deep enough to be heard. My mother, he said, voice low, waited so many years for someone to tell her what happened. He kept his eyes on the dark opening before us, as though the answers might climb out on their own. I let my hand rest on the cold stone. It still held the day's warmth in tiny patches. She deserved better than silence, I said. He nodded, but his nod held more weight than agreement. It carried exhaustion and something like surrender. The field was different at night. The cicadas fell quiet, and the tall grass leaned our way, bending in a single direction like followers of a tired sermon. The smell of earth thickened, damp and faintly metallic, a reminder of what we had found the evening before. Fabric. Rusted metal. A truth too heavy to stay buried. I could feel the shape of my father in all of it. Not the man he was in life, but the shadow he left behind. A stern man, yes. A quiet one, always. But gentle in ways he never learned to name. His guilt had followed him like a second spine in his last years. I'd seen it in his hands most, the way he held tools, held cups, held silence. I looked at Elias, knees drawn up, fingers laced loosely between them. He wasn't just grieving the man in the well. He was grieving the years of not knowing. The years his mother had spent by the window, listening for a step that never came. The night deepened. The field breathed. And at the edge of everything, the well waited, patient, unchanging, almost kind. Elias brushed a thumb across the stone beside him, as though tracing an old signature. "Tell me again," he said, "about your father. The way you remember him." I hesitated. Memory is a fragile thing. It bends if you hold it too tightly. "He wasn't cruel," I began. "People thought he was hard, but he just didn't know how to let go of things. Even the small things stuck to him. Like this." Elias motioned gently toward the well. "Like this," I echoed. A cloud shifted above us, letting the moon pour down in a thin line. It lit the inside wall of the well, just enough to show where moss clung in stubborn patches. Elias cleared his throat. "You said he came out here that night because of the storm." "Yes. He heard shouting," I said. "Or maybe he only thought he did. The wind plays tricks out here. My mother used to say the field remembers every voice." "And the ground gave way?" he asked. "That's what he told me." The truth tasted heavier now. He said he reached the edge, and the earth just folded, like it was tired of holding the weight of all that hurt. Elias looked back into the dark, as though trying to picture the moment through my father's eyes. The rain, the shouting, the panic, the collapse. "The lantern?" he asked quietly. He had it with him. Always did. Glass already cracked. He said when he tried to climb down, he slipped. Hit the wall. Lost the flame. The night pressed in a little closer. "So he tried to pull the boy out," Elias said, barely above a whisper. "But he couldn't." I didn't answer. Some truths don't need confirming. They just settle between two people like dust settling on an old table. Quiet, inevitable. The field exhaled, bending toward us again. The grass whispered things we weren't ready to say aloud. Elias leaned forward, elbows on his knees. His breath made the smallest tremor in the air. "My mother always believed it was punishment," he said. "That the earth swallowed him because it wanted him gone." The pain in his voice wasn't sharp. It was worn, soft at the edges. "She was wrong," I said gently. "Your brother wasn't alone. Not at the end. My father stayed with him, even when he knew there was nothing left to do." Elias shut his eyes, just for a moment, and when he opened them again, the anger that had lived there for years was gone. In its place was something quieter, a grief allowed to breathe for the first time. "He tried," I continued. "He spent the rest of his life trying to make peace with that night. Every map he drew, every note, every time he came back here and walked the edge." I swallowed. He carried the loss like it was his own child. The wind shifted direction, turning warm. It brushed a lock of hair across Elias's forehead. "I think he believed the truth would break your family," I said softly. "So he chose silence. Not out of fear, but out of protection. Or what he thought was protection." Elias's voice cracked just barely. All this time, we thought he didn't care. He cared too much, I whispered. The field fell completely still. As if listening. As if relieved. We stayed there a long time, saying nothing, letting the night settle around us like an old blanket finally pulled from storage. The well below held its shadows, but they felt different now. Less like secrets, more like memories returning to their rightful place. Elias ran a hand over his face, long and slow. When he dropped it, his expression had softened into something almost peaceful. "So what do we do now?" he asked. I looked out across the field. The grass swayed again, lighter this time, carrying the smallest sigh of understanding. "We honor them," I said. "And then we forgive the ones who tried their best, even when their best left scars." A faint rustle moved through the dark, like the wind nodding in agreement. We rose from the well together. And for the first time, the night didn't feel heavy. It felt like it was making room. Dawn arrived the way an old friend does, quietly, with no need to knock. Its first light brushed the rim of the well, turning the cold stones a soft, muted gold. The field, still damp with night, held its breath as Elias set the small candle down. The flame trembled once, then steadied. A thin ribbon of smoke rose into the pale morning air, carrying something I couldn't name, grief, maybe, or gratitude. Beside him, I felt the land loosen its shoulders, like it had been holding a story too long and finally found someone willing to listen. We didn't speak. The morning spoke for us. The sky opened slowly, stretching itself across a horizon washed in lavender and soft gray. The cold clung to the cuffs of my sleeves, settling into my bones in that gentle way early mornings often do. Elias kept his eyes on the candle. He crouched low, one hand braced against the stones, the other hovering near the flame like he feared a breeze would steal it. His breath fogged in the air, shaky but sure enough. "This is for him," he said at last, voice roughened by the night we'd lived through. "My mother used to light one on his birthday. Said candles help lost things find their way home." His words settled into the field like seeds dropped into waiting soil. I looked around us, the tall grass still dewed, the trees standing like patient witnesses. This place, once heavy with unanswered questions, felt different now. Not lighter exactly, but clearer. As though the earth had exhaled sometime during the night. My father's memory stirred in that stillness. Not the man stooped by guilt, but the man who taught me how to tie my boots, how to mend a fence, how to listen to the land instead of trying to tame it. I saw the way he'd pause before speaking, always choosing silence first, as though weighing every word for hidden sharp edges. I had carried his silence like a burden for years. But this morning, it felt less like a weight and more like a language I was finally learning to understand. Elias rose slowly, wiping dirt from his palms. He looked older in the morning light, not worn, just settled. "He deserved to be remembered," he said. "So did my father," I whispered back. And between us, the well held both truths gently. I heard the footsteps before I saw him. Steady, familiar, with the soft drag of someone hesitant to interrupt. Daniel approached across the field, hands in his jacket pockets, shoulders hunched against the morning chill. He stopped a few steps away, eyes moving from me to Elias, then to the candle resting on the stone. "You two okay?" he asked quietly. It was a simple question, but in that moment, it felt like a door creaking open. Elias offered a small nod, one that held more sincerity than words could. I think I'm getting there." Daniel's gaze found mine. He didn't rush. Daniel never rushed. "You want to tell me what happened out here?" I let the silence stretch, not to avoid the truth, but to honor it. The morning seemed to lean in, as though willing me to speak. So I did. Slowly, with the care the story deserved. I told him about the storm, the shout carried by the wind, the ground giving way beneath frightened feet. I told him about my father climbing into the dark, slipping, striking the stone wall, losing the lantern's light. About the panic he never forgave himself for, the hands that reached but found only cold, wet air. And I told him how he had spent years returning here, quietly, secretly, carrying the weight of a boy he couldn't save. Daniel listened without moving, the way someone listens to the last song a person ever wrote. His chest rose slowly, fell even slower. When I finished, he looked down at his boots, scuffing the toe against the soft earth. "That must have been hell for him," he murmured. "Carrying all that alone." "It was," I said. "For both families." Daniel raised his eyes, and in them I saw the same shift I'd felt earlier. That subtle rearranging of things inside a person when a truth finally lands. Elias stepped closer, voice soft. My mother, she'll want to know. Not everything, maybe, but enough to let her sleep at night. Daniel nodded. Let me know when you're ready. I'll come with you. The morning warmed by a few degrees. Or maybe we did. Elias walked back to the well, kneeling once more beside the candle. The flame wavered in a gentle breeze but held on with stubborn strength, the way grief often does. I wish I could have met him, Elias said, not looking at me. Your father. Not the man who carried the guilt, the man before. I crouched beside him. He would have liked you, I said. He had a soft spot for people who asked hard questions. Elias smiled faintly, the kind that isn't about happiness, but about understanding. Maybe he and my brother would have gotten along too. The candle's glow brushed his cheeks. His eyes glistened, not with tears, but with the tenderness that comes when sorrow finally stops fighting to stay hidden. What do you think happens now? He asked. I let my hand rest on the stone. It was warming under the sun. I think, I said slowly, the land finally gets to rest. And so do we. He closed his eyes, almost in prayer. I'm coming back in spring, he said. Not to dig up anything else. Just to sit. To bring flowers. To remember without hurting so much. There was promise in his voice, small, almost shy, but real. When he opened his eyes again, the tightness that had lived at the corners was gone. Not erased, just eased. A beginning, not an ending. Daniel stepped closer, placing a steady hand on my shoulder. We'll take it one season at a time, he said. And somehow that felt like enough. Elias stood, brushing the dirt from his knees. The sun rose fully then, spilling gold across the field, casting long shadows that stretched toward the well like open arms. He looked back at the candle, still burning, still brave. I'll see you in spring, he whispered to the quiet, and the quiet accepted it like a promise it intended to keep. As he walked away, the land seemed to shift under our feet, no longer heavy with secrets, no longer holding its breath. Daniel and I remained a moment longer, watching the little flame dance against the growing light. The past, finally named, settled into the earth with a softness I hadn't felt before. And as the sun climbed higher, I wondered, what grows in a place once burdened by silence? When the truth is finally allowed to rest,